Welcome to the final part of my Eternal set review. The last part today will be about the Stonescar cards and the couple of colorless or factionless cards, depending on how you want to call it. Alright, so let's get started. The first card is Combust. The Stonescar 1 power 2 influence card. As we've seen, there's one in every combination. This one, once again, is not much affected by being 1 power, but double influence, because it's a card you can not cast on turn 1 anyway, because you normally won't have a unit, and also, even if you could, the opponent probably wouldn't have a unit that you would want to use this on. So all in all, basically just a 1 power card that has to be in the Stonescar faction combination in order to be castable. Other than that, there's no relevant restriction, unlike with the 1-drops that are not real 1-drops most of the time because of their restriction. So in Constructed, this card doesn't have much use right now, but it has a lot of potential in my opinion. There is, first of all, a really nice combo with Madness, the 3 power card from Shadow that steals an opposing unit for 1 turn. So you can steal that, attack, and then use Combust to sacrifice their unit to kill another one of their units. So you basically attack them with their best unit, kill their 2 best units, and that all for the cost of 4 power and 2 cards for 2 cards. So you're breaking even in cards, but gain a lot of tempo with the damage that you can deal, and also with the quality advantage that you get, and their units combined probably cost more than 4 power as well. Also, if they have an infiltrate unit, for example, you might also be able to trigger the infiltrate and so on. So there's a lot of potential value to be gained. The downside, obviously, is you need both cards in order for that to work. But the other thing is there's a lot of units that give you like free units or are good if they die with like Entomb triggers like this guy that you can use this on. For example, there's Grenade-in tokens from like Grenade-in drone and stuff, where you get like an extra free token that you can use to cast Combust with, for example. So the card has a lot of potential, but currently there's not really a constructed deck that utilizes them well, but it's definitely not a bad card. And in Limited, this is a pretty solid card if your deck has enough things that won't mind dying, like Dark Wisp, Grenade-in tokens, and some of the other units with good Entomb that are not too costly, because you always have to like keep tempo in mind. Like Stonescar Magus, for example, is another pretty decent one. Then you often get to kill 2 units for the cost of 5 mana and 2 cards. It's kind of like a weak version of the Madness Combust, and you might also just have Madness in Limited as well. So all in all, a pretty good pick if you're in the Stonescar combination, in my opinion. Next we have another Stranger, one of the better ones this time. 2/2 quick draw for 2 is pretty decent. Still, Strangers are not a thing in Constructed, but in Limited it might be fine to play this guy. It's still not exciting, and there's always the risk of enabling opposing Strangers, but it's a decent 2-drop, I would say, especially if you have ways to enhance him like combat tricks and weapons. Next we have Obsidian Golem, a pretty solid 2-drop that currently doesn't see that much play in Constructed, because there's just no deck that really wants him, or they have better alternatives. But the card is, in my opinion, theoretically Constructed playable, because you get a decent 2-drop that is kind of removal proof, in the sense that against more reactive decks, controlling decks, they will have to kill him eventually, but they don't really kill him, because you basically get the body back to replay it as a weapon on another unit. So they kind of lose a card while you don't, which is really nice against control decks, and it also makes your best unit bigger, so it's harder to remove him with conditional removal, or harder to block and stuff like that. And in Limited, this is even better. In Limited, I think this is a really good 2-drop, and a fairly early pickup if you're in the Stonescar colors. A nice aggressive card. Next we have Treachery. Treachery is a bit of a weird card. There's like fairly reactive big burn decks that run this, but even in that deck I'm not that big of a fan. I mean, sure, it's kind of like Caleb's Favor and okay in the sense that you get to deal 2 damage for a card and 2 mana, 2 power. But yeah, I mean, sometimes like in the early game, you obviously also get the bonus of trading 1 for 1 card-wise, just like Caleb's Favor. Although in Caleb's Favor you only get a sigil. Here you get a unit from the opponent, the best in their hand. But the problem is that's quite tempo negative basically, and later in the game they might not have a unit, and also taking the unit might not be that impactful. I'm a bit torn on the card. It's definitely a decent card. I can see it as like a nice sideboard card in the burn deck, for example, for certain matchups. But not super excited about the card in Constructed. It's solid, I guess. And in Limited, I would say the card is fairly bad. I would not put this card in my deck, just for the same reason basically as Sabotage. First of all, it's tempo negative. Second of all, cards are fairly interchangeable in Limited usually. And third of all, you're basically losing tempo. You spend your second turn doing nothing that impacts the board, while the opponent played 2-drop probably. So you're falling behind already. So better not put this in your draft deck usually. Next we have Bloodrite Callus. This is a pretty interesting one, I would say. Since you cannot control what you sack, you basically just sacrifice everything, which turns this into a really huge weapon. There's like some fun constructed deck that someone recently built that plays a lot of entomb units and token production and stuff to go wide and kind of swarm the opponent and eventually turn their entire board and entomb triggers into a big callus to try and finish off the opponent, for example, or kill their threat and then kill the opponent afterwards if they have no unit anymore. But yeah, it's more of a kind of semi-competitive fun deck. It's not like a legitimately good deck. And the card is very hit or miss because you're very all in on it. And yeah, in Limited, I think this card is not very good usually, unless your deck is really well drafted around it. Because you have to sacrifice everything. Like you have to have a board where first of all you have only units that you don't mind sacrificing to this, and second of all, the opponent has to have a board that's small enough to not punish you for it, in the sense that you kill one of their guys and then the rest of their guys kill your callus on the backswing and then you lost everything. So it's very situational, but I guess it can be good in the right deck in Limited sometimes. Next we have Brimstone Altar, another sacrifice themed card basically. This time we get to sacrifice 1 unit for free every turn in order to deal 2 damage to the enemy player, which is not very good in my opinion, because once again, as with a lot of these cards, with these relics, we spend 3 power for doing nothing, and then we spend no power for setting us back on the board by throwing away our units and therefore costing us even more tempo. So all in all, unless you're doing something really strong and that is capable of making up for the lost tempo and everything and constructed with this, it's a pretty terrible card in my opinion. And in Limited, it's kind of the same. Sure, it can be kind of a weird win condition and way to enable some of your better entomb triggers in a stalled out game, but usually that shouldn't be what you want or need. So yeah, even in Limited, not very exciting. Next we have the Stonescar Champion. Champion of Chaos is arguably the best champion in the game. Close before Champion of Glory, I would say. A 3/3 for 3 power is a fine deal, I would say. A lot of the time, at least in Constructed, this will at least be a 4/4 for 3 on turn 3 and quickly turn into a 5/5 Overwhelm Deadly and become an incredible monster. 3 power for those stats is incredibly good. There's plenty of 4-drops that have worse stats and less abilities, And the Overwhelm Deadly also makes it so if you block him with 1 unit, they always overwhelm you for 4, because the champion only has to deal 1 damage to the blocker and deals the other 4 to the player. So it's also basically really hard to not at least take 4 damage from this guy if you are trading with it in combat, which makes it such a good 3-drop in the burn deck. And well, in limited, it takes a little longer to turn him into a 5/5 Overwhelm Deadly, but it's still an incredibly powerful card and a premium first pick. Next card is Bandit Queen, the legendary 4-drop of Stonescar, a very nice aggressive card. 4 power 3/2, not very impressive at first glance, but she also has charge, and the thing that makes her so powerful is her summon trigger. If you summon her, all your units get +1 attack and quick draw this turn, which basically makes your entire team really hard to block, because they all get 1 bigger than their regular stats, puts them usually like one step up in the curve, and the quick draw makes it so that the opponent basically also usually needs units that are 1 slot higher in the curve to have the sufficient stats to block them without dying, making it really hard for the opponent to block, and if they don't block at all, they would usually die, so there's often a bunch of jump blocking and suboptimal blocks happening for the opponent, setting them even further back and putting them kind of in a lose-lose situation. If they block, they fall behind. If they don't block, they die. Really great card in Constructed and also in Limited. In Constructed there is a 1-drop heavy deck that plays 4 of these. It's called Stonescar Jiddo, plays Frontier Jiddo and all the good 1-drops, and Bandit Queen basically for a constant stream of going wide charge attackers. A really great card in Constructed. Next we have Black Iron Manacles, another one of these weird slow relics. This one is basically an anti-control card in Constructed, not a main deck card, because once again you spend 4 power for very little effect, but after you play it, basically the opponent takes usually at least 1 damage per turn and potentially more. I am not sure, actually, since I've never seen the card in action, if discarded also refers to cards that the opponent played, like for example if you play a spell and it goes to the void, if that is considered discarded. But yeah, control decks usually have ways to draw multiple cards a turn, so they will often take more than 1 damage, and it's also hard to remove, which makes this a nice alternate threat against control decks. But other than that, the card is pretty terrible and slow, so I would not play this on ranked. It's mostly a sideboard card for tournaments. And in limited, this card is just really bad. Don't put this in your deck. If you draft it, turn it into 200 dust and be happy. Next we have another 4-drop legendary, Statuary Maiden, where Bandit Queen is the queen of aggro decks. This is basically the queen of midrange. First of all, 2/4 deadly is pretty good defensive stats, survives stuff like Torch, which is important. Deadly means that she can block a lot of units that have higher health than her 2 attack, but for example only 3 attack or less and don't kill her. So she makes for a really annoying blocker. And the key is in her trigger, basically. Every time an opposing unit dies, they are turned into a 1 power +2/+2 stone cudgel, which is basically a really efficient weapon. And yeah, normally you're gonna play this in some kind of Stonescar midrange deck, which usually features a lot of removal. So every time you kill something the opponent plays, it turns into a 1 power +2/+2 weapon for you to make either the Statuary Maiden or other units bigger, and that snowballs pretty quickly and usually generates a couple of really big threats on your side, which are really hard for the opponent to beat. It's also worth noting that the unit gets transformed into the cudgel, so the unit will not end up in the opponent's void and go to your hand, so this also is a really great suppressor card against decks like Haunting Scream and other reanimation stuff. And it also, I think, prevents Entomb effects, because I think they turn into cudgels before the Entomb can trigger, but I'm not 100% sure on that, because I don't have seen that interaction yet, because I haven't played the deck much, and it's also not played that much on ladder. But correct me if I'm wrong in the comments if this does not stop Entomb. I am not sure right now. And yeah, in limited, obviously another bomb, easy first pick. Great card. Next we have Runic Revolver. 2/2 weapon for 5 is pretty bad stats. The fact that it has quick draw is kind of nice. It allows you to pick off multiple units with 2 health or less without the weapon getting destroyed by the damage of the unit. The fact that it deals 2 damage to the player is pretty irrelevant, and I would rather have it be 4 power, for example, and not deal 2 damage to the enemy player. The summon makes the cost unnecessarily high and is super irrelevant, basically. So yeah, in Constructed this card is pretty unplayable. In Limited it's not great, but in a slower deck this could be okay to play if you need a couple more playables for your deck. Next we have Scrap Tank. A pretty good 5-drop. Basically what you get is 5 power and 5 health, 5 attack and 5 health for 5 power, which is an okay deal. You get it in the form of a 3/3 and 2 1/1s, but the nice thing is, whenever another of your units dies, Scrap Tank gets +2/+2, so basically if you use the 2 grenadins you get to like jump block opposing units, for example, you basically end up with a 5 power 7/7 that gained you a certain amount of life from blocking opposing units, and you might also have other units that you can either throw away or can sacrifice with combos and stuff. So if there's like a sacrifice themed unit, this is one of the prime 5-drops for this. Currently the card doesn't really see that much play because there's no like competitive sacrifice themed unit. And yeah, in Limited this card is obviously also really great. Great stats, 3 bodies for 1 card, and so on. Potential to really grow, get out of hand quickly if the opponent has no hard removal for it, and so on and so forth. Next we have Smuggler's Stash. Basically a huge card advantage source if your deck is built around it. Like if you have a good mix of units and weapons, then this is potentially up to draw 4. And you also definitely draw 4 non-power cards, because unlike an actual card draw spell, you might end up with 1 or 2 power at a spot in the game where you don't need the power. This gets you pure gas. 2 units, 2 weapons, full value, 4 cards for 5 mana and 1 card. This is occasionally played as a card advantage source in armory decks, either main deck or sideboard, and in Limited, yeah. Basically pick this early, build a deck around it, win the late game with this. Just a pretty good card all around, just a bit situational, but as long as you can have enough targets for both parts, then the card can be really powerful and easily flip a game around. Drawing 2 units and 2 weapons should win most games that you are not already losing. Next we have another 5-drop unit. Nothing too exciting here. 5/5 for 5 power is decent, not a card that you're looking for in Constructed, but a pretty good body in Limited, also fairly splashable, given that it's a high drop and only costs 1 of each influence. And it actually has a really nice influence trigger, because once it dies, basically only his health disappears and the 5 attack are transferred to whatever unit you please. So this is actually pretty powerful and limited, I think, if it's not too slow. Like sometimes it can be too slow. But if the game is not over too quickly, this guy generates a lot of value and good trades. Next we have Infernal Tyrant. This card is a bit weird. 6/6 for 6 power is nothing special but solid. Lifesteal is pretty nice on such a big unit because it really helps in racing, especially in limited. The fact that it deals 2 damage to your other units can be pretty problematic. The idea basically is to deal damage to as many units as possible without killing them, so you get a bunch of life because you gain 2 life per unit that takes damage, because the lifesteal also applies to that ability. But the problem is you will usually have some units that might die to it, which causes this to be kind of a value and tempo sink. So you have to make sure to set this up properly, but then unanswered this has the potential to win a limited game because a 6/6 lifesteal is pretty powerful. In Constructed, this card is kind of like a decent card in Stonescar mid-range decks that need some late-game defense and stabilization. I've seen this played a couple times, but I'm not too impressed with it, especially because it's so expensive and has only like a negative effect on the board the turn you play it, and there's plenty of ways to remove it. But yeah, people play it. I don't think I like it in Constructed much. There should be better things to do with that much mana, that much power. But yeah, in Limited it's a pretty good card. You just have to be a bit careful in setting it up. Next we have Stonescar Leviathan. Another expensive legendary. 7 power, 7/7. Nothing exciting, no evasion, no overwhelm, nothing. All we get basically is that if this thing dies, the opponent's health becomes 7, no matter what it was before, which is not that exciting because the 7/7 doesn't die that easily, and often already puts the opponent pretty low before it dies, and then yeah, you won't get much value out of it, or might even give the opponent a couple of health points because they're already below 7. The only thing that this basically does is that you get some decent value if it dies right away. Like if you play this for 7, the opponent kills it with a Death Strike for 4, then you at least get some value, which kind of makes it a bit less bad against removal. But all in all, weird card. Constructed, definitely not playable. In Limited, not exciting, pretty expensive, no evasion. Meh. If my deck is slow and needs a couple of fatties to win in the late game, this might be okay to put in. And last but not least, we have the Stonescar Legend, Voprex the Great Ruin, 7 power, the usual 6 restrictive influence, 5/5 flying overwhelm, which is pretty weak, to be fair, for a 7-drop, and the summon trigger is pretty bad. Giving the opponent a choice is never good, and in this case the opponent gets the choice between discarding the entire hand or sacrificing all their units. So usually what will happen is, at the point you cast this, your opponent will have 0 to 1 cards in hand a lot of the time, 1 often being like that 1 power that he held back, which he is happily gonna discard. Or the opponent has a lot of hand cards and barely anything in play, and then they will just sacrifice their 1 bad unit, or choose to sacrifice all their units even though they have none, because they can choose either effect if they don't have anything, like they can discard their hand if they have 0 cards in hand, they can choose to sacrifice their units if they have 0 units, and then if they have that many hand cards and not much board, they're probably gonna be some kind of control deck and have a lot of removal, so they're just gonna kill it for less power investment than this guy costs. And 5/5 flying overwhelm is a pretty bad rate for 7. So basically the 7 power 7/7 flying overwhelm dragon from the Fire faction is basically a better 7-drop than this in Limited and even in Constructed, probably. because in constructed the decks are either control decks or creature decks. Creature decks usually don't have much hand cards left and they discard their hand, and the control decks won't have any units, so they sacrifice the units. Just a really bad card. A perfect example of why giving your opponent the choice is bad, especially if it comes in combination with such bad stats. Alright, after we finish the Stonescar section, I'm quickly gonna go over the factionless cards at the end. So these cards are all basically mostly relevant for draft. So for constructed they can basically all be disregarded. First we have Spiked Helm, a 0 power +1/+1 weapon. Even though it's free, it's usually too low impact to put in your deck because it's just not worth the investment of a card, even though it is a bit of a tempo swing and the opponent will often have blocks that make this not even matter, so you get 2 for 1 and stuff. Just not a good card. Next we have Worn Shield, 1 power +0/+3, basically equally bad or worse than Spiked Helm. Doesn't give any attack, +0/+3 usually is not very relevant and way too weak for the investment of a card, just a bad card. Then we have the 5 color fixing strangers. They might even be relevant in constructed if there is like a stranger deck, because it will often be 5 colors and needs fixing for all the colors that it plays. So does your limited deck a lot of the time. So if you are in one of the main combinations, I think these guys are actually pretty good, because in limited getting color screwed is really bad. There's not that much fixing. You basically rely a lot on having both your colors in your opening hand in order to operate properly, and then you might have double influence requirements in one or both of your colors, which makes it even trickier. So having some of these guys as your 2-drops to fix your colors is really great and makes sure you don't lose the game before it started due to power and influence troubles. So these are actually better than one might think, even though they are just 2 power 2/2. Next we have Daze, another pretty bad card. I'm already not a fan of stuff like Rebuke in limited, and this is basically a bad Rebuke because it doesn't silence. So another terrible card. Generally the factionless cards are pretty weak because they go in any faction, which unfortunately makes a lot of them go in no faction at all because they're too bad. Next we have Alchemical Blast. While this card is not great, I think it's an okay option for certain decks that just need some removal, like a way to deal with some early flyers that otherwise might get out of hand, or like a controlling deck, or like defensive mid-range deck that just wants all the removal it can get to deal with opposing threats and eventually win in the late game with bombs. This might be fine. Another Stranger, usually not very appealing because you want to be 2 factions in limited, which would make this a 3 power 2/2, which is really bad. And yeah, in constructed, if there is a Stranger deck, this might actually be interesting because it can be a 3 power 5/5 that gets all the Stranger bonuses if you have a 5 color Stranger deck. But since there is none at the moment, this card is not useful for anything. So that concludes my set review for Eternal. We have talked over all the cards now in both formats. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you found it interesting, helpful and or entertaining, as usual, please like and subscribe to help the channel grow. And yeah, thanks for watching. There will be future content in the form of constructed deck techs and draft walkthroughs with the follow-up games and stuff, now that I have concluded the review. Thanks for watching, see you next time, bye!